Open a King James Bible and search for the word hell. You will find it 54 times. Now open a New International Version and run the same search. You will find it 13 times, and not once in the entire Old Testament. The English word hell appears 41 fewer times. Not because modern translators went soft on judgment or decided the afterlife needed rebranding. It appears fewer times because behind that single English word, the biblical text contains 3 recurring terms in 2 different languages, and those terms do not describe the same reality. Most of those 54 occurrences trace back to the Hebrew word Sheol, the Greek word Hades, or the Greek word Gehenna. One exceptional Greek verb, used only once in the entire New Testament, accounts for the remaining instance, and we will return to it before this investigation ends. The King James translators, working in 1611, used the word hell for occurrences drawn from all 4 of these terms, even though they did not translate every occurrence in the same way. Most modern Bibles separate them. And when you pull those original terms apart and read what each one carried in its own language and context, you discover that the Bible's picture of death, judgment, and what comes after is more layered and more precise than the single image most of us absorbed growing up. So, what are these words? Where did they come from? What did the original writers mean when they used them? And what changes when you stop hearing one flat English syllable and start listening to 3 very different voices? Let us begin with the oldest of the 3, a Hebrew word that appears roughly 65 times in the Old Testament. The word is Sheol. If you are reading the King James Version, you have encountered Sheol many times but probably never recognized it, because the translators rendered it 3 different ways. 31 times they called it the grave. 31 times they called it hell. 3 times they called it the pit. 3 different English words for the same Hebrew term. That alone creates confusion because the same original word sometimes sounds like a hole in the ground and other times sounds like eternal fire, depending entirely on which chapter you happen to be reading. Modern translations have made different choices. The NIV renders Sheol as the grave, the realm of the dead, or death, depending on the passage. The ESV and NASB mostly leave it untranslated, printing the word Sheol and letting the reader investigate. But none of these modern translations use the word hell for Sheol. Not once. Why? Because when you read the passages where Sheol appears, the picture rarely matches what most English speakers now imagine when they hear the word hell. Consider Genesis chapter 37. Jacob has just been told that his son Joseph is dead, torn apart by a wild animal. Jacob tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, and refuses to be comforted. He says, "In mourning will I go down to the grave to my son." The word behind the grave here is Sheol, and Jacob is not a villain. He is a patriarch of Israel. The text never suggests he expects to go to a place of punishment. He expects to go where his dead son already is. Sheol in this passage is the destination of the grieving father, not a sentence imposed on the wicked. Now consider Psalm 6, verse 5. David is crying out to God in distress, and he says, "Among the dead no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave?" Again, the word behind the grave is Sheol, and the point David is making is striking. In Sheol, no one praises God. There is no remembering of him there. This is poetic language about the finality and the silence of death, a place described not with fire, but with absence. The book of Ecclesiastes presses the point even further. Chapter 9, verse 10 says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the realm of the dead, where you are going, there is neither working nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom." Now, Ecclesiastes has its own rhetorical voice. The writer is exploring the limits of what can be observed under the sun, and his language about Sheol reflects that particular angle of vision. It would be a mistake to read this single verse as a complete theology of the afterlife, but the picture it paints is unmistakable. Sheol, in this writer's experience, is where the activity and awareness of earthly life come to an end. These passages illustrate a broad pattern. In much of the Old Testament, Sheol is the common condition of all who die. Righteous and unrighteous alike descend there. Jacob expects it. David expects it. The writer of Ecclesiastes assumes it. Sheol is not consistently presented as a place of post-mortem punishment, but that is not the whole picture. Other Old Testament texts associate Sheol with God's judgment on the wicked. Numbers chapter 16 describes the ground opening to swallow Korah and his rebels alive, and they go down to Sheol as an act of divine punishment. Proverbs chapter 9 warns that the guests of the adulterous woman are in the depths of Sheol. Isaiah chapter 14 uses Sheol as the destination where a fallen tyrant is brought low. In these passages, the descent to Sheol carries moral weight. It is not neutral. So Sheol is not a single, tidy concept. It is a broad Hebrew term for the realm of death, used sometimes as a synonym for the grave, sometimes as a poetic image of silence and stillness, and sometimes as the place where the wicked are brought low by God's judgment. What it does not consistently describe is the picture most modern English speakers attach to the word hell, a place of conscious, fiery, eternal torment reserved exclusively for sinners. That image does not come from Sheol. And when the King James translators place the word hell on top of it, the result, however understandable in the English of their time, brought connotations the Hebrew text did not consistently carry. But here is the crucial nuance. In 1611, the English word hell was not as narrow as it is now. Its roots go back to the Old English hell, or hell, from the Proto-Germanic haljo, which meant something like the concealed place, the hidden realm. In its oldest usage, hell was closer to what Sheol actually meant, the unseen place of the dead. The translators were not smuggling in fire and brimstone. They were using the nearest English equivalent available to them. The problem is that over the following centuries, the English word hell narrowed dramatically. Today, when most people hear hell, they hear eternal conscious torment, lakes of fire, and final damnation. That narrowing is the source of the confusion, not necessarily the intent of the translators. Now, let us cross the language barrier. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, roughly 2 centuries before Jesus, the translators of the Septuagint needed a Greek word for Sheol. They chose Hades. Hades had its own history. In Greek tradition, Hades referred to the god of the underworld and to the underworld itself, the realm where all the dead went. In the oldest Greek sources, Hades was not primarily a place of punishment. It was where the dead existed, a dim and insubstantial afterlife beneath the earth. That broad meaning overlapped with the Old Testament concept of Sheol, enough for the Septuagint translators to adopt it. The fit was imperfect because Hades carried overtones from Greek culture that Sheol did not, but the core idea was similar, the domain of the dead. In the Greek text normally used by modern translations, Hades appears 10 times in the New Testament. The King James Version, following a slightly different manuscript tradition, includes an additional occurrence in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 55, which brings the total to 11 in that translation. 10 of those are rendered hell, and 1 is rendered grave. By the time of Jesus, the concept behind Hades had evolved in some streams of Jewish thinking. During the centuries between the Old and New Testaments, Jewish writers developed more detailed pictures of what happens after death. Some envision the realm of the dead as having distinct regions, one where the righteous rest and another where the wicked suffer. You can find these ideas in texts like 1st Enoch and other Second Temple literature. This is the backdrop for one of the most vivid afterlife scenes in the New Testament, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16. In that story, the rich man dies and finds himself in Hades in agony, surrounded by fire. He looks up and sees Lazarus far away at Abraham's side in comfort. A great chasm separates them. The Greek word in this passage is Hades, not Gehenna. And the picture Jesus draws uses imagery that his audience would have recognized from Jewish traditions about the afterlife during that period. Many Christians understand this passage as depicting an intermediate state, a condition between death and final judgment. Others read it differently, but whatever position one takes, the primary purpose of the parable is not to provide a detailed map of the afterlife. Jesus is telling a story about wealth, indifference, and the urgency of hearing the message of Moses and the prophets. The afterlife imagery serves that larger argument. What the passage does make clear is that Hades in the New Testament is not the same as the final judgment. The rich man still has living brothers on earth. He wants someone to warn them. This is not the end of the story. And the book of Revelation confirms the distinction with startling directness. Chapter 20, verses 13 and 14. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Read that carefully. Hades is not the lake of fire. Hades is emptied and then thrown into the lake of fire. They are two distinct realities. The intermediate condition and the final judgment are not the same thing. And yet, in the King James Version, Hades is translated as hell, and the lake of fire is described separately. An English reader encountering both passages absorbs the same word, hell, without realizing that the original text draws a line between them. Now, we come to the third word, and this one carries a weight the other two do not. The word is Gehenna. It appears 12 times in the New Testament. 11 of those occurrences come from Jesus himself. The 12th is in James chapter 3. And in every major modern English translation, Gehenna is translated as hell. Because of the 3 recurring terms, this one comes closest to the image most English speakers carry when they hear that word. But Gehenna is not a theological abstraction. It is not borrowed from mythology. It is a real place. Gehenna is the Greek form of the Hebrew phrase Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, a narrow, rocky valley running along the south and southwest of the old city of Jerusalem. You can visit it today. Its history is terrible. 2 Chronicles chapter 28 records that King Ahaz burned incense in the Valley of Hinnom and passed his children through fire, following the detestable practices of surrounding nations. 2 Chronicles chapter 33 says the same about King Manasseh. 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 10 explicitly connects a site within the valley called Topheth with the practice of passing children through fire to Molech, and it records that King Josiah desecrated this site to prevent anyone from using it again. Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 31 records God's condemnation. They have built the high places of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. Jeremiah chapter 32 verse 35 links the same practices to offerings made to Molech and worship of Baal. Scholars continue to debate some details surrounding these practices, including the precise etymology of the word Topheth. Some connect it to an Aramaic word meaning hearth or fireplace, but this remains a proposal, not a settled conclusion. What is not debated is that the biblical writers regarded the Valley of Hinnom as a place of profound abomination, a site stained by the worst sins Israel ever committed. King Josiah defiled the valley deliberately, and the prophet Jeremiah transformed it further. In Jeremiah chapter 19, the valley becomes a prophetic image of divine judgment, a place so filled with the slain that its very name will change to the Valley of Slaughter. By the time of Jesus, the Valley of Hinnom had already accumulated centuries of prophetic weight. In Jewish tradition, the name Gehenna had become a symbol of divine judgment and eschatological reckoning. Jesus did not invent this association. He intensified it. Now, a popular explanation you may have heard is that by the 1st century, the Valley of Hinnom had become Jerusalem's garbage dump, a place where refuse burned day and night, providing the perfect visual backdrop for Jesus' warnings about fire. This image is repeated in countless sermons and study Bibles, but there is no archaeological or literary evidence from the 1st century to support it. The earliest known source for the burning garbage dump claim is a commentary by Rabbi David Kimmy, written around 1200, more than 1,000 years after Jesus. Lloyd Bailey, writing in the journal Biblical Archaeologist in 1986, stated directly that there is no evidence the valley was a garbage dump. That does not mean fires never burned there. But the confident assertion that Gehenna was a perpetual municipal incinerator in Jesus' day does not hold up under scrutiny. What does hold up is the prophetic tradition. The valley's association with child sacrifice, divine condemnation, and national catastrophe had already made Gehenna the most loaded geographic name a Jewish teacher could invoke. And Jesus chose it. When he warns in Matthew chapter 5 verse 22 about the fire of Gehenna, or in Matthew chapter 10 verse 28 about the one who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna, or in Mark chapter 9 about Gehenna where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, he is not reaching for a generic term. He is reaching for the name that carried the heaviest possible weight in Israel's memory. That final phrase in Mark echoes Isaiah chapter 66, verse 24, where the prophet describes the fate of those who have rebelled against God. In Isaiah's original context, the image is of corpses under divine judgment, consumed by worm and flame, a picture of total irreversible destruction. Jesus takes that image and places it at the climax of his warning. Christians across traditions have understood these warnings differently. Some read Gehenna as eternal conscious torment. Others understand it as final destruction, a complete and permanent end. Still others hold alternative views. This is not a question the text resolves with a single sentence, and this investigation does not pretend to settle it. What the text does make unmistakably clear is that Jesus treated Gehenna with deadly seriousness. Whatever Gehenna ultimately means, Jesus did not use it casually. Now, before we close this investigation, there is one more term to account for. We noted at the beginning that the King James Version translates hell 54 times, and 3 recurring words account for 53 of those. The 54th comes from a different word entirely. In 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4, the text says that God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell. The Greek behind this is not Gehenna, not Hades, and not Sheol. It is the verb Tartaroo, a word related to Tartarus, which in Greek tradition was the deepest pit of the underworld, a place of imprisonment for divine beings who had rebelled against the cosmic order. Peter borrows this culturally loaded term to describe the confinement of fallen angels held in chains of darkness reserved for judgment. Tartaroo appears nowhere else in the entire New Testament. It is not a synonym for Sheol, Hades, or Gehenna. Its single occurrence reinforces the very point this investigation has been making. The English word hell is asked to carry meanings that the original texts kept carefully distinct. So here is what we have found. Sheol is the broad Hebrew term for the realm of the dead, used across the Old Testament to describe the condition that awaits all who die. It can be poetic, somber, and morally weighted, but it is not consistently a place of punishment. Hades is the Greek term frequently used for the realm of the dead, and, in Revelation, appears as a temporary reality that is emptied before the final judgment. Gehenna is the word Jesus chose for his most urgent warnings about divine judgment, rooted not in abstraction, but in the blood-stained soil of a real valley south of Jerusalem. These are not simply interchangeable names for one perfectly defined place. They belong to different linguistic and historical settings, sometimes overlap, and sometimes emphasize different aspects of death and judgment. And when a single English word absorbed all three, the distinctions collapsed. Sheol became hell, even though the Old Testament does not consistently describe it as a place of torment. Hades became hell, even though the New Testament treats it as something distinct from the final judgment. And Gehenna became hell, which is the one case where the translation comes closest to carrying the weight of the original. But even there, the specific history of the valley and the particular force of Jesus' choice were flattened into a general category. The shift in modern translations is not about weakening Scripture's teaching on judgment. It is about refusing to let one English word obscure what the original languages actually say. When the NIV prints the realm of the dead instead of hell for Sheol, it is not erasing accountability from the Bible. It is declining to place an image of fire and punishment, where the Hebrew text placed an image of silence and death. When the ESV prints Hades instead of hell, it is not softening the message. It is preserving the distinction between the intermediate state and the final sentence. And when many major modern translations still print hell for Gehenna, it is recognizing that this word, more than any other, carries the gravity the English reader expects. Precision does not weaken the Bible's warnings, it sharpens them. When Jesus says Gehenna, he is not being vague. He is being as specific as a person can be. He is naming the worst place in Israel's memory, the valley where children were burned, the ground God cursed through Jeremiah's mouth, the site Josiah deliberately defiled so that it could never again be used for child sacrifice. And he is saying, this is what it looks like when human evil meets divine justice. The Bible has more to say about death, judgment, and what lies beyond them than any single English word can hold. Three ancient terms, each with its own history, its own weight, its own landscape. When you let them speak in their own voices, you do not lose the Bible's teaching on consequences. You hear it, perhaps for the first time, with the precision the original writers intended. Subscribe for more investigations into the original language, history, and context behind Scripture's most familiar passages.